While the dead may be buried, their spirits live on in the hearts and memories of those who knew them during the time on this earth. Indeed, while a cemetery is primarily a home for the dead, it is also a place where the past has taken root and flourished. To walk a cemetery is to walk with history. In Atlanta, the past and present converge in the Oakland Cemetery. Citizens from all walks of life are interred there, those prominent and those not so prominent, all contributing their voice to the chorus of Atlanta's history. And particularly at certain times of the year, this voice becomes much more literal than metaphorical, and the cries of the dead are audible to the living. The history of the Oakland Cemetery is fascinating in its own right, even if there were no phantoms whispers heard there. In 1821, farmers began to arrive to the area that became Atlanta, attracted by the offer of land lotteries. More people arrived, and the site became the terminus of the Georgia Railroad and the Western and Atlantic Railroad, creating by 1837 a rough and tumble area of rail hands and prostitutes. By 1847, this town of 10,000 voted to change its name from Marthasville to Atlanta. Young people were drawn to the town and its thriving economy, but as the population grew, so too did the need for public burial grounds. 3 years later, the self-proclaimed founding fathers of Atlanta purchased 6 acres on the east part of town for use as a cemetery. The first man to be buried at the cemetery was a Chicago doctor who passed away in 1850 while in Atlanta for a convention. Terrified as he was of being buried alive, Dr. James Neeson had asked for his throat to be slit before he was lowered into the ground. It was. After 17 years, the cemetery spanned 88 acres. In 1872, what had been City Cemetery became Oakland Cemetery, so named because of the numerous oak trees on the property. By the late 19th century, the final plots of Oakland Cemetery were sold. Buried within the original 6 acres of land are the early influential of Atlanta, including 6 state governors, 24 mayors, senators, and representatives. Dr. Joe Jacobs is buried here. He owned a pharmacist where one day an entrepreneur created a concoction he called Coca-Cola. Bob Jones, winner of the Grand Slam of golf in the 1920s, lies in the same ground as Margaret Mitchell, author of Gone with the Wind. Those less famous are here too, buried in Potter's Field. There are over 17,000 each, unidentified, but remembered nonetheless. Today, little has changed in Oakland Cemetery, besides the paving and bricking over the old dirt roads. With its elaborate headstones, sculptures, and mausoleums, it is considered a Victorian-era cemetery. But there are other ages to see here too. A plot of land called the Black Section is where, before the Civil War, black slaves were buried, identified by both their names and their owners. After the war, blacks continued to be buried here, and just west of the original 6 acre stands a 65-foot obelisk made of granite from Stone Mountain. When first erected, it was the tallest structure in Atlanta. This monument marks off the Confederate section. Interred within are the bodies of unknown Confederate and Union soldiers. Notables lying here include Alexander Hamilton and Brigadier General W. S. Stephen. In July 1864, Atlanta was home to more than 20,000 people. Shortly after, Sherman began his march through Georgia. By November, fewer than 1,000 residents were still in Atlanta when the city began to burn. Bodies of the dead soldiers were piled in trenches in Oakland Cemetery and then buried during the last hours of the attack on Atlanta. Still others arrived from a makeshift hospital blocks away in Cabbagetown. By the end, Oakland Cemetery was the final resting place for over 3,000 Confederate and 16 Union soldiers. Watching over these buried soldiers is the Lion of Atlanta, a 30,000-pound marble lion lying on the base 17 feet high. Carved in the likeness of the Lion of Lucerne in Switzerland, the lion lies prostrate, its heart pierced by an arrow, its head cradled by the stars and bars of the Confederate flag, honoring those who died for their ideals. It is here where the past can truly be said to come alive. In a book entitled Georgia Ghost, Nancy Roberts recounted the experience of a visitor to the cemetery while standing by the Lion of Atlanta. The visitor was shocked to hear phantom sounds. Amid rustling leaves, he heard the sounds of weapons clanging. Then, most surprising, voices seemed to be calling from beyond the grave. A roll call of soldiers was heard, as if they were no longer content to be nameless. The same visitor also saw ghostly apparitions moving amid the trees, shadows of fighting soldiers. Visitors to the cemetery are likely to hear the phantom voices, particularly in November or December, likely because it was at the time of the year in 1864 when so many Confederate soldiers were buried. Names are called out, and then, against the whispering wind, a number of voices answer and reply. One will hear these voices and know that it is the dead who are speaking. Know that it is what is being heard is the roll call of these soldiers, unknown no longer.